So hello everyone, welcome to the 5th Foot Anstey Solent Stakeholder Forum on nitrates. I'm delighted that once again so many stakeholders have joined today. As the invitation said, it's been 2 years since our inaugural event, and in this webinar we'll recap the history and also look to the future, indeed the emerging trends that are now enabling some development to take place. This has been a painful journey for many, and we hope that by continuing with these forums we can share the very latest information with you. It therefore gives me great pleasure to introduce the panel of speakers today, who will give you the very latest developments and information in what will, I'm sure, seem like a very short hour. We've got a lot to pack in today, so I will canter through the agenda. There is a slim possibility that we might run over, but I'll do my best. So first to speak will be Christian Silk. He's a legal director in our planning and environmental team and head of strategic infrastructure planning. Christian will set out the legal framework, including the implications following the Fairham judicial reviews. Second is Simon Kennedy, who is the Strategic Environmental Planning Officer working on behalf of 14 LPAs on a strategic approach to the issue of nutrient neutrality in the Solent region. He will be giving you the latest on where the partnership for South Hampshire have reached in solving the immediate problems. And following on from Simon, we will hear from Purgal Linham, Solent Nutrient Trading Platform Project Manager of Natural England. Purgal has spent the last 3 years at Natural England as a team leader covering Hampshire landscapes before moving to her current role earlier on this year. And she's going to be sharing the slot with Dr. Douglas McNabb. He spent the last 2 years at DEFRA on environmental planning issues, including nutrient pollution. They will be reminding everybody on the pilot trading platform we introduced at the last webinar and what it may look like when revealed next spring, and indeed discuss the longer term. Our penultimate speaker is Peter Holm. Peter is an Associate Director at Turley Southampton office and leads a team of experts at Turley, providing specialist planning advice and support to many clients impacted by nitrates or phosphates across the south of England. Peter will be running through the current solutions and the reality of the situation, what is working and the hurdles we still have to overcome. Lastly, we'll hear again from Christian, who will give a roundup of the webinar and cover any points that haven't managed to be squeezed into any of the talks. He will also be discussing how our learning from the nitrate issue can now be carried across to help the phosphate situation. To round up, we will look to answer as many questions as time will allow us. And with that in mind, you'll see your question and answer tab. If you click that at any point throughout the hour, we will try and get you some answers at the end. As you're aware, or as I hope you're aware, you're on this webinar that you know about nitrates, what the problem is and why the Solent is affected. If you don't know, I have an article on our Foot Anstey website explaining all of this. It was on the 17th of May 2019 that Portsmouth News reported that Natural England released guidance to the local planning authorities in the Solent region regarding new build homes having to be nitrate neutral. Thus, the moratorium on building began. As the issue started to emerge into the public domain, we quickly contacted local planning authorities, other stakeholders, developers, Natural England and the Environment Agency, and held a Chatham House roundtable event on the 3rd of July 2019. At that event, we realised that this issue was significant. Hopefully today you will hear that we've reached a point where the anxiety can start to fade as new innovative ideas come forward, and for both the short and long-term solutions can be found to keep our region busy, building and prosperous. First of all, I have a poll, just the one question if I may, and what we'll do is we'll just have a quick look at that when it's answered, and then I will hand over to Christian. So I will, relaunch poll, continue. Can everyone see that poll? Peter, can you nod? Great, okay. So let's just see what people have got to say. Oh, lots of people. Oh. Okay, let's end the polling there, shall we? Right, so let's share the results. So as suspected, most people think it's been solved in part, but some people still think no. So I'll hand you over to Christian and hopefully he can start to change your mind and you can start to see some light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you. Over to Christian.
Thanks, Nicola, and hi, everyone. I think that the outcome of that poll was possibly more positive than I might have anticipated, but we'll see if there's greater certainty as a result of this presentation. So I'm just going to take you through a quick and high-level overview of the key cases that has led to the current position where nitrates neutrality needs to be proven for certain projects in the Solent area. And this will feed through to the subsequent presentations that will address some of those solutions that have been devised and are being devised. So the first case is the Dutch case that dates from 2018, and this concerned authorizations for schemes for agricultural activities in sites protected by the Habitats Directive. And as you will guess, this was a Dutch matter. And the Dutch government had taken a programmatic approach to consenting certain projects that would affect these protected sites. Now, the programme was subject to detailed scientific study and appropriate assessment. And the programme set nitrogen deposition thresholds for specified projects. And there were three key thresholds. The first threshold was one below which projects didn't need a consent, so long as they were consistent with the terms of the programme. The second was for projects that fell between thresholds that needed to be notified. And the third was for projects that exceeded the top threshold, which required their own separate permits. So subsequent to that, 6 permits were issued for projects which exceeded the top thresholds. And the third party appealed against the decision to issue those permits without an appropriate assessment for each. Now, the European Court held that a programmatic approach might be acceptable in certain circumstances, but also that individual projects may also require appropriate assessment. The authorizations for activities which may subsequently compromise the ability to restore European protected sites to favorable conditions and achieve the conservation objectives is necessarily limited. So this concerns, therefore, the need for habitat regulation assessment and appropriate assessment for individual projects. It wasn't possible in every case just to rely on a programme that was overarching, that was setting a framework for consenting projects. So the second case, again from 2018, is People Over Wind. This concerns an approach to screening for the need for habitat regulation assessment. This related to an application for a wind farm grid connection cable, and if pollutants from laying it would harm pearl mussels. So the project was screened out for the need for habitat regulation assessment as mitigation measures were taken into consideration at that screening stage. And that was consistent with the existing case law at the time that was done. However, the European Court held that projects shouldn't be screened out as a result of mitigation measures, and that these were different from conservation measures and preventative measures which were embedded in a project, and that appropriate assessment must remove all reasonable scientific doubt in relation to the effect of the proposal. Therefore, the outcome of this case was that you can't screen out projects by taking into consideration mitigation measures. A habitat regulation assessment might be required and an appropriate assessment. So on to the next slide. These cases led to Natural England issuing a letter to the Solent local authorities, advocating that in their capacity as competent authorities, the Solent local authorities should take a precautionary approach to granting planning applications and the need for habitat regulation assessment and appropriate assessment for projects that have an implication on the Solent's European protected sites. This led to the temporary moratorium on development that Nicola mentioned, and solutions have been devised since then. And Natural England issued subsequent advice notes, which have been revised several times, setting out an approach to calculating nitrogen neutrality. So that led on to the recent Ferrum judicial review cases, and there were 2 of them, one known as the Warsash and the Western Wards, and the other Brook Avenue Residents Against Development. These both related to relatively minor development proposals. The Warsash matter was for 6 residential units and Brook Avenue was for 8 residential units. The judicial review claims were made on a number of grounds, not just in relation to the impact impact on nutrients. However, one of the key issues which has caught the headlines as a result of these judicial reviews was an attempt to attack Natural England's advice note, which set out guidance as to how to calculate nitrogen neutrality. Now, the Wasatch claim succeeded in part, but not in relation to the Natural England advice note. The Brook Avenue claim was dismissed on all grounds. So the outcome of those two judicial review cases is that Natural England's advice note stands and is sound. Now, moving on to my final slide, just touching on the Brook Avenue Residents Against Development judgment, the judge in that matter said that Natural England's advice was in fact impeccable. But there is a note of caution, and this is actually reflected in Natural England's advice note in any event, that there might be circumstances where occupancy rates used to make a nitrates calculation should differ from the advice note. In fact, the advice note states that authorities can adopt bespoke calculations where there is sufficient supporting evidence. So that rounds up where we are in terms of the case law, which is that Natural England's advice note is sound. There is a need for habitat regulation assessment and appropriate assessments in certain cases, and that mitigation measures shouldn't be screened out at the screening stage. So I'll hand over to Simon now, who will talk you through some of the responses that have been devised by the push authorities.
Yes, thank you, Christian. And I just thought I'd pause for a moment on this title page because, of course, these green algal mats that you can see on the picture in front of you are the effects on the habitat and where nutrients aid this growth and affects the valuable species that try and feed in the areas. But moving on, I thought I'd start with a little bit about my role and how it came about. So you'll be aware that the issue of nutrients and how they move through groundwater and how development goes to wastewater treatment works that potentially discharge to different areas of the Solent, as is well, you know, all of the different protected areas of the Solent whose condition assessments play a role in this. It does span across administrative boundaries, and really the response must be coordinated due to that. Another key reason for my role and part of how I try and assist mitigation coming forward is being a single point of contact for stakeholders. So we'll hear from DEFRA later. I sit on one of their project groups, liaise closely with Natural England, the local authorities and stakeholders such as the development industry. And really I'm there to investigate, report on and potentially deliver local authority interventions or processes which are going to allow sustainable development to start taking place again across the area. So talking about those authorities, on to the next slide. There is 14 of them, and I've just highlighted 3 of them in green there because we're really lucky in the Solent. We've got the Partnership for South Hampshire body that helps coordinate these cross-boundary issues. But indeed, this impacts catchments with neighbouring authorities that are not part of that body, and they are also contributing to my role. It is recognised that this cross-boundary issue goes beyond those kind of organisations, and you really need to look at all of the contributors across the catchment areas for the protected sites. You know, some of these authorities already, you'll be aware, have delivered nutrient mitigation. We've seen Portsmouth and Fareham and other authorities look at retrofitting of existing housing stock to reduce nutrient inputs. We've seen Havant and indeed now Eastleigh directly engage with the mitigation markets. So some really good work by some of the local authorities already. So moving on. What have I done in my role? What are the Partnership for South Hampshire doing to try and bring this forward, this sustainable development again? Well, we started by doing some extensive stakeholder engagement. It highlighted 3 main issues. As you'd imagine, initially access to credits was was clearly the main issue, actually finding mitigation that satisfied the legal and environmental requirements to act as mitigation. And then uncertainty really relating to cost and time for the legal agreements to secure that mitigation. And it's all the way through. It's does the agreement between the developer and the mitigation provider look like? Does it need to be conditional on planning conditions? And then how would you provide certainty to the local planning authority it's going to be maintained for the lifetime of the dwelling, which will be a requirement of the appropriate assessment. So there has been a lot of cost and time involved with working our way through those legal agreements. Another key point that came out of the stakeholder engagement was that there was a disproportionate impact on SMEs, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a following slide. And it's important to remember the local authorities must consider plan making, the habitat regulation assessment is part of plan making, nutrient neutrality is part of that, decision making. Clearly, we've seen the judicial reviews. We know the requirements of the habitat regs and the appropriate assessments. And they've got to act as the competent authority with regards to those requirements. And, that they really have got to be certain, have some certainty about the best scientific evidence, the lifetime of the dwelling, and indeed the uncertainty and enforceability of mitigation schemes to give that certainty moving forward. So, there is a lot to consider. There is a lot of things that we need to make sure are in place to make this process as easy as possible. So moving on to the next slide, if I can. I'll just cover each of the key points from the stakeholder engagement in turn. So delivering mitigation schemes. We are seeing mitigation schemes really start to come to market now and provide effective mitigation for development, sustainable development. And those mitigation providers really need to look at the habitat requirements of the habitat regs, the nutrient guidance from Natural England, undertake some desk-based studies looking at the overall nutrient budgets of their land use change, the transfer rates, use the discretionary advice service, and think about those legal framework options. And a number of landowners have gone through this process, and as I say, they're bringing their credits to market. So I've got an example here. It is a real life example from one of the catchments across the Solent. And you can see the stacked line. So the top line is the total available credits, and there's the immediate need. So that's the applications held up in the planning process because of neutrality across all the local authorities, and what the estimated 5-year need is for nutrient neutrality. And in this particular instance, represented by these 3 lines on the mitigation sites, we are seeing that there is enough credits within that catchment already, enough nutrient mitigation land in order to mitigate development for over the next 5 years. So it's really encouraging. We're seeing mitigation sites coming forward, and we're seeing credits become available, which is excellent. But moving on, if I can. The legal framework, this issue of legal and how much time and cost it's taking, and it is complicated. And we've seen from some local authorities this framework where you enter into an overarching Section 106 agreement with the mitigation providers and this is between the local authority and the mitigation provider, particularly for these sites that it's off-site. And this overarching Section 106 agreement is an agreement that has been put in place. Fareham Borough Council are really the forerunners in the area. They have a couple of agreements with mitigation providers. So that's gone through the development industry, and it's to their satisfaction, it would seem. It's the satisfaction of the permitting LPA, and indeed to the mitigation providers. So there is a framework emerging. But it may be conditional. It may be that all of the legal frameworks to support mitigations will not be exactly the same, because there is issues to do with covenant strength if it's in private ownership, and how you get that certainty it's been held in perpetuity. There's potentially got to be some kind of instrument to transfer enforcement of powers if your permitting local authority is in a different administration area to where your mitigation site is, and this is why this cross-boundary kind of work is really important here. So you've got to work through that. But really, we're aiming to try and standardise the process and produce some form of conformity in the approach between the LPAs. And we're working towards that. We are seeing some examples of that, and it's hopes that we'll be able to carry this through to the majority of local authorities impacted. And of course, where local planning authorities directly control credits, it may be that the only framework required is to collect the funds, much like we see in SMRS payments for Solent waders and Brent geese. But moving forward, if I can, just a quick one on the impacts on minor development. So because of the administrative and legal costs when you're securing your mitigation from a commercial mitigation provider, essentially, you pay proportionally more for your mitigation per dwelling, because you're essentially splitting your legal costs and your purchase costs between fewer dwellings. Now, we see these economies of scale obviously throughout, but it is clear that the issue of nutrient neutrality does add to that disproportionate impact that you might see in costs for smaller developers. And that does have planning implications. So there's national and local planning objectives to do with supporting smaller site development and minor development potentially. We see that in the MPPF, where 10% of sites should be coming from smaller sites. Potential impacts on brownfield and regeneration development, and of course the reduced ability to ensure the right houses are built in the right places, and that's to do with housing supply and speculative applications. Wider implications for the impacts on SMEs, jobs, local economies and skills. We all know what happens if smaller developers start to struggle to run profitable businesses. So if I can move on. Yeah, very final slide before the last one. You'll see that I looked at the 5-year horizon. There's a number of potential solutions that might change how supply and demand in the nutrient mitigation goes forward. You can see them on the slides there. Of course, improvements in wastewater treatment works, potentially a big one. But there's on-site stuff which we'll hear about later, and of course the DEFRA trading platform, who I'll be handing over to after the next slide. So the very final slide. My contact details there. Really happy to engage with anybody that wants to ask further questions or has any issues, and indeed we list all of the mitigation sites that essentially are actively supplying credits to the market and have got to a certain point with Natural England in terms of agreement of the site. The Partnership for South Hampshire website shows that information. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to the DEFRA team if I can. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Doug McNabb from DEFRA's Land Use Division. And myself and Pergul from Natural England are going to give a bit of an overview and update on the Solent nutrient trading pilot. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'll just briefly set out the context for this work. I'm going to try and kind of canter through this just to give you a bit of an overview. So I think most people on the call are probably quite aware of the nutrient pollution issue already, but important to note that this is now having impacts on development across a number of other parts of England, not least Kent and Somerset. So it's a really growing issue, and it's a growing issue to the extent that we now have a cross-government task force with regular meetings with Minister Powell and Minister Pincher on the from the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, and that's really trying to coordinate work across departments looking for solutions to this issue. I think a key part of that work I wanted to emphasize is that that's very much a kind of a twin track approach. So on the one hand, there's lots of work going on the sort of short-term actions to try to unlock housing delivery, whilst avoiding further harm to these really important protected sites. But alongside that short-term work, there is a lot of longer-term action also taking place. And that's all about actually trying to improve the condition of these protected sites. So these sites that are not currently in favourable condition. And just to make you aware, there's a range of work going on in that space. So on the one hand, there's a lot of work around agriculture and agricultural policy reform. So looking at things like expanding the amount of advice through things like catchment sensitive farming to farmers, looking at enforcement of existing regulations and how we can get better targeted visits and perhaps make use of new technologies like drone surveys. And we've also got the emerging environmental land management scheme, which is aiming to provide incentives to land managers to provide environmental benefits, and that very much includes looking at actions to reduce pollution. And then complementing the longer term actions on agriculture, there's also a range of work going on looking around the water industry and wastewater treatment works. So there's permit reviews, one option, and there's a permit review going on in the Solent at the moment. And we're also looking at opportunities to try to accelerate upgrades in some of those key wastewater treatment works and the options for doing that. So just wanted to highlight that there is that wider work going on, and it's not just the kind of perhaps the more visible nutrient neutrality work. I think important also to say that the Solent has I think made quite a lot of progress in this area, as Simon and others have highlighted already. And I think there's probably quite a lot of useful learning from this area for other local authorities and other developments in other areas. We've certainly found working closely with Simon and others from Partnership South Hampshire has been really valuable in helping to get that kind of strategic approach and help to try and make progress. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to focus in a bit on the aims of the nutrient trading pilot specifically. And this project is very much kind of aimed at building on and complementing the work that Simon was outlining earlier that he's been doing. So the aim of the trading pilot is very much about testing a new market-based approach for securing these mitigation solutions that developers need. So looking at questions around feasibility and costs, and also how we can try and maximize some of the wider benefits of those schemes for people and nature. And we're aiming to trial a nutrient trading process which can match up developers who need these solutions via some sort of online platform with land managers who are willing and able to bring forward suitable mitigation sites. And as I'm sure a number of you know, the general focus has been on trying to look at long-term land use change. So for example, from agriculture to woodland pasture or wetland, because we need to have the certainty that that change is going to be in place for an extended period. It's very much a multi-agency project, a 2-year project running through till autumn next year. And we're certainly lots of interest in this project and about applying the lessons learned both within the Solent area, both to a lot of other parts of England facing similar challenges. So if we can go on to the next slide. I just wanted to give a bit of an update on what we've been doing so far on the project. So an initial focus was very much on a rapid user phase. So similar to some of the work Simon was talking about really trying to engage with a range of users for a trading process and to understand what they would need from that process, what it would need to do for them. So we had a dedicated social researcher who did some really useful interviews with a range of landowners and developers. We've also been engaging with local authorities, including through Simon. And that has provided us with some really rich insights to inform the ongoing design of how this process will actually work. A range of engagement events in there as well, including an engagement event facilitated by Foot Density late last year. And we've just wrapped up a survey with landowners as well. So a lot of work on user understanding. We've also had some really useful technical advice from economists at Exeter University around the design market itself, so getting into the detail of how those trading rules might work and how we match up developers and landowners and get the best outcomes for everybody. We've been recently working up some project updates and some frequently asked question documents for landowners initially, but also for developers. And I think we're aiming to have those online hopefully next week to share with sales and with wider stakeholders, and we hope that will really support wider understanding of the project and wider engagement. Also, just continuing on the engagement theme, so Natural England has been leading a lot of that work on the FAQs alongside some quite intensive work trying to reach out to farmers in the Solent through various local groups, including farm clusters. And we're hoping to continue doing that work up to and then after harvest period to really try and drive that engagement and that awareness. Alongside all of that engagement work, we've also had the Environment Agency doing some quite technical water quality mapping and modelling for the Solent area. And that is really about trying to understand the best locations for mitigation sites. So where might we best target projects to maximise the pollution reduction? So, and actually, in a sense, where can we be most efficient? Where can we get most pollution reduction for minimum land take? That feels like quite an important question to answer. And we're also very much in procurement phase at the moment. So we've got a number of bits of this work that are going out to external contractors, and that includes the trading platform design itself and a monitoring and evaluation contract as well. And if we can just move on to the next slide. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Pergel from Natural England, and she's going to tell you a bit more about the detail of how the pilot process might work, and also a bit about the timescales and how you can get involved.
Thanks, Doug. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. We've been having some problems with that. So yeah, this next slide is just to kind of give you an idea of how the pilot project is likely to work. The diagram provides an early indication of the key steps that we're looking to work through, with a focus on steps for landowners preparing to sell credits, as you can see along the top row, and steps for developers or perhaps local planning authorities wishing to buy credits, shown along the bottom row. This represents an indication at this stage, as many of the steps might be altered, or we may add to those as we continue our development and we work with our trading platform operator and gather further stakeholder feedback. So this is an iterative process that we're working through. Farmers and landowners will identify land suitable for a long-term mitigation solution in conjunction with my Natural England colleagues. They will ultimately need to approve the proposal before those enter the trading market. This process can take many months to achieve, and we've already started working on this. As Doug has has alluded to, we're talking to landowners who came forward during the earlier engagement work or completed our landowner survey, as well as through our existing networks at Natural England and some of our colleagues in other organisations. We believe involvement will provide an opportunity for farmers to reassess farm or estate business objectives and consider what a new income stream from selling nutrient credits could help to achieve. For example, investing in new equipment or technology that enhances efficiency or allows diversification. To generate credits, landowners need to commit to appropriate land use change. Again, as Simon was talking earlier, and Doug has described, we're looking at change from agricultural use such as cereal production or livestock farming to creating and maintaining habitats such as wetland or woodland for a period of 80 to 125 years, which is the considered lifetime of the development. They will retain ownership of the land within this trading platform project, and any new owners would be required to maintain mitigation measures for the same period. Short-term changes such as annual cover crops are not acceptable for this scheme, as we need to the certainty that mitigation measures will be in place for that long term. We're looking at focusing our pilot on the test and itching catchments first, This is because this appears to have the biggest gap between supply and demand currently. We're also exploring the scope to trade biodiversity net gain credits alongside nitrogen credits as part of the same trading platform. This should help to boost returns to landowners and reduce the cost for nitrogen mitigation to credit buyers. And in my next slide, I'm going to just talk through the projected timeline and some key dates. So right now, as we've mentioned, we're continuing our engagement with developers, local planning authorities and landowners. We will shortly begin further mapping and modelling work, which will identify the most appropriate mitigation sites that will deliver the objectives, getting the most nitrogen reduction for the least land use take, as we have described. Between August and December, our trading platform operator will be in place, and we will be working with them to develop the platform and the market rules. We'll continue our stakeholder engagement during this time, gaining further feedback as part of a monitoring and evaluation process and using modelling outputs as they are generated to prioritise more detailed targeting of mitigation site suitability. During the first quarter of 2022, the trading platform and trading rules will be fully tested and a pilot market run to test the concept. During May to late autumn, we'll be planning the implementation of mitigation measures with landowners, and we will complete our project evaluation, considering the lessons learned and what these might mean for a future national rollout. Finally, my next slide. So how can you get involved? Oh, that's right, thank you. How can you get involved if you haven't already? Please get in touch via our project mailbox, which is shown on the screen, and we'll keep you in the loop with our project updates. If you have any specific questions that we've yet to answer in the FAQs, once you've had a chance to look at them, then please do contact us with those questions. And we will be updating the FAQs as we go and provide new information and new answers to your questions. We also will be updating, providing updates to the Push website under our subpage, thanks to Simon, and the FAQs will be hosted there, and any other information that we have up to the point that the trading platform website is operational. If you're a landowner with a possible mitigation site, I don't know that there's that many landowners today, but if you are or you know any, please point them to us. We'd love to discuss any mitigation scheme options that you want to consider as soon as possible. We anticipate going live with our first market round in spring 2022. So you can register to take part when the time comes to do so. So you'll hear through our email and through the Push website when that opportunity is available. We will complete our first full evaluation during autumn 2022, and we'll use this to demonstrate the effectiveness of the trading platform approach to deliver a successful nutrient credit market, all being well. And my final slide is just thanks for listening. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Peter Holm now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Purgle. That's great. So I'm going to finish off this the main section of the webinar just by having a look largely at the developer's perspective here, at what the current situation is and how people are trying to approach mitigating their nutrient impacts. Okay, so if we can move on to the first slide, please. So let's remind ourselves, I know we're aware of broadly where is affected, but this map, which is focused mainly on Hampshire, does show the extent to which it's affected. This area goes some 27 miles inland from the coast, so it is a vast area with well over 2 million people living in this area that is affected. So the effect is very significant, and thus the emphasis that you've heard from local government and from central government on trying to look here first to solve the problems, which is great news. Okay, so let's move on. So as of now, these are the key choices that a developer has when they want to build in that area. We heard very encouragingly that there will be further options coming along in the future. For example, the permit review of wastewater treatment works, which the Environment Agency are currently engaged in, not before time, but it's good that they're doing it now. And also clearly the DEFRA online trading platform pilot will be great once that's up and running. And you heard my colleagues from DEFRA saying that they're working on it as fast as they can now, which is great news. But as of today, our basic solutions are on-site solutions, buying your own agricultural land for offsetting purposes, or trying to secure credits from one of the existing third-party schemes. And I'll go into each of these in more detail. So first bit, okay, so looking at on-site solutions, there's two broad approaches. The first one is wetland creation. Wetland creation is a fantastic thing to do because clearly it's a very much a nature-based solution. It's very good for biodiversity net gain and can be of good amenity and open space value. The problem with wetlands is that it doesn't actually help you mitigate the impact of wastewater, foul water. It only tackles the surface water runoff element of your site, so is of limited value by itself. However, it is an appropriate option for some greenfield sites, certainly. The other problem is that it does take up space, and it has to be balanced with the amount of other types of open space that are required. It does require quite expensive long-term management, and its ability to implement it is impacted greatly by topography and geology of the site. But it's still something that I do encourage my clients to consider in the right circumstances. Moving on. So what you can do to complement a wetlands area to tackle the wastewater is on-site solutions. Now, in theory, and I do say in theory, this can now capture quite a high proportion of nitrogen from wastewater. And clearly where you're outside of main sewerage, this is the only option that you have. The problem is that these treatment plants are by their nature variable. You tend to get what you pay for, and the ones that are sort of more affordable in the market simply don't have the performance that you'll need to reduce your nitrogen impacts. And also their performance can change over time. It can quickly deteriorate if they're not maintained and upkept to the required specification. They also don't deal with surface water nutrients, so you'd have to look at wetlands or whatever else is your solution in addition to these. And they're just simply not practical on many sites, depending on the ground conditions and the geology and that kind of thing. Also, the key problem is that the Environment Agency simply advises against them, except where essential outside of the main sewerage area. So there is a presumption against these solutions, so they're not generally appropriate on the majority of sites, but still it is a fallback option. So then your next option is to buy your own land. And this, to be honest, is what a lot of house builders have been doing since the guidance first came out in 2019. The good thing about it is, of course, it can mitigate up to 100% of your nutrient impact, and the developer can retain control of the process, so they can buy exactly what they need, and they can control where that mitigation site is going to be and all the rest of it. And it can also provide clearly additional benefits in terms of public open space and biodiversity net gain. The problem is that clearly this is a very expensive solution. And also, if all developers and house builders were doing this, what impact is that going to have on the agricultural land market? Anecdotally, we've already heard of speculation with agricultural land and prices increasing in certain areas, and that's really not what a desirable impact that anyone would want on the agricultural land market. Sourcing the land is consequently therefore a challenge, particularly when you have to think of what's called the spatial and the temporal issues. What that basically means is the relationship of the mitigation land compared to the development site. How close is it to the development site? How close is it to the nearest river, which the development site is draining into? And the temporal issues looks at the time it takes for the nutrients, which were from the agriculture on the mitigation land to get into the protected areas. So how long does that take? And if you take away those nutrients, how long is it before you're going to get that benefit? And sometimes where you're draining into chalk areas, infiltration, it can take actually many, many years. So you might not actually get the benefit for this land for a long time. So it's really important that you seek specialist advice on where your mitigation land is going to be, what the geology is, what the drainage and hydrology is going to be, because you can't just assume that any piece of agricultural land will do the job. That's not the case. Okay, let's move on. I'm hurrying a little bit because I'm just aware of the time, but the third solution I want to talk about is clearly the one that we've heard mentioned already today, and that's the third-party agricultural schemes for offsetting land. And so far as the logos show there, we've got 7 schemes operational, which are offering to the whole catchment. There are other schemes which are just contained to certain local planning authority areas, but the most famous one, of course, is the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, but there are others as well, some private, some public sector. These schemes are great, particularly for the smaller developments and the brownfield developments that simply don't have the option of buying their own agricultural land or putting in wetlands or whatever the case may be. They are the smaller types of development that simply need to pay a financial contribution as their way out of this, because there is simply no other practical solution. So in that case, although we heard Simon say correctly that for smaller developments the cost is proportionately high, they have no choice. They have to pay it because there is no other solution for them. But also there clearly are strategic nature-based solution opportunities here. The opportunity to create much larger and strategically more sensible areas of public open space or wildlife enhancement areas, whatever the case may be. And that's something that the Wildlife Trust is clearly in the business of doing and doing extremely well with their solutions. So I take my hat off to them for that. The problem is with this kind of approach so far is you've got such variability in supply. It's basically down to a catchment lottery. In some catchments, you've got, as Simon was saying earlier, adequate supply. We'll look at that in more detail in a moment. In other catchments, there simply isn't enough. And perhaps reflecting that as well, the cost is very variable as well. The lowest I've seen is about £1,400 per kilogram of nitrogen, and the highest about £4,500. So a huge variation in cost to the developer. And of course, that's not including the administrative and legal costs. That's only the cost per kilogram of nitrogen credit purchased. Hopefully, we will see that improve once the market opens up with the DEFRA online trading platform, but clearly that's something that we will need to see emerge as that platform is put in place. There are also very significant cost and time barriers for actually establishing these types of schemes in the first place. Simon and DEFRA and Natural England colleagues touched on this, and they're going to try and to help expedite that, but at the moment it takes a long time and a lot of cost for a landowner to get their land converted to an appropriate mitigation use and to market it and for developers to buy it. It is a complicated process, and that's reflected in the small number of schemes that are currently operational. And also we have to be aware that whilst overall the local authorities in the Solent area are all trying to solve this problem, they are not all trying at the same rate and in the same direction. There is variability and there is inconsistency of approach amongst local planning authorities, which is not helping developers. Okay. So if we look more specifically then at where the mitigation schemes are, we can see that there are 2 within the Test and the Itchen Valley. That's the blue and the pink areas. And there are 5 in the East Hampshire and the Chichester, Langston Harbour catchment. So there's disparity, really, a disparity whereby the largest area impacted has got the smallest number of mitigation sites at the moment. And we'll have a look in more detail about what that actually means in terms of numbers of homes. But it is very encouraging, therefore, that DEFRA has recognised this disparity and are looking as a priority at the Test and Itchen valleys, which I see as the absolute top priority now for rolling out further mitigation capacity, because it simply ain't enough at the moment. Okay, let's move on to have a look at the numbers. So the 2 at the top there, which are in the sort of the purplish pink colour, are the 2 in the Test and Itchen Valley. So a combined total of about 4,500 kilograms of nitrogen. And if you take an average, a very average level of nitrogen credits required per dwelling, that's sufficient for about 2,500 homes. If you look at the East Hampshire catchment, you can see there's credits available for a lot greater number of homes. So that's just evidence of what the disparity we're looking at. But it's actually slightly worse than that, because the wastewater treatment works in the East Hampshire area tend to have lower permit levels of nitrate. So we're talking about Peel Common, Budds Farm, the very large coastal wastewater treatment works. which have quite low levels of nitrate permit, which reduce the level of mitigation that developers have to provide. Whereas many of the wastewater treatment works in the Test and Itchen Valley are well away from the coast, and they are simply ones without any permit level for nitrates. So you have to take the absolute top whack level of mitigation requirement. So it's going to take up more of that mitigation capacity for a smaller number of homes. So it is really important that we address this disparity as quickly as we can. Okay, next slide. So let's just finish off by having a look at a few highs and lows in terms of what local planning authorities are doing. And I do want to give credit. You don't often hear developers giving credit to local planning authorities, but there are some who should be given credit to, because they've certainly stepped up. Havant Borough Council, if you're lucky enough to have a development site there, they will provide the most help, and their website is enormously helpful. They've got their own mitigation scheme, Warblington Farm, which is the cheapest mitigation land in the Solent. So you are well taken care of if you've got a development site in Havant. Also, Eastleigh Borough Council have stepped up and they've put their own farmland into mitigation sites, both in the East Hampshire and also in the Test and Itchen Valley catchments. So you're pretty much okay in that area. But Eastleigh, encouragingly, have not limited their capacity just to their own local planning authority area. It's available catchment wide, which is really encouraging and very good. Portsmouth deserves a mention for their very innovative scheme, which is based on retrofitting social housing to improve water efficiency and thereby generate credits that way. Clearly, that's not available to many local planning authorities who've sold off their social housing, but for those who kept theirs, it is an option on the table, and Portsmouth have certainly used it. The other local planning authorities in the East Solent are either working with third-party mitigation schemes, or they're trying to develop their own approach, but they are slower behind the three that I've highlighted. Next slide. And have you looking at the West Solent, so the Test and the Itchen Valley areas, again Eastleigh there, because they straddle both catchment areas, and Winchester are also certainly quite advanced in having a look at their own scheme. They did start to look at accepting financial contributions, but as they haven't actually identified a scheme to spend those contributions on, they've had to stop doing that, because they were sort of running before they could walk, if you like. They weren't quite ready to start doing that, but they certainly expressed a great deal of willingness to assist developers as soon as they can. However, the others, the Test Valley and others like that they are lagging behind, and they really do need to try and do a bit more to help developers in their area as soon as possible. Okay, next slide. And finally, just a mention for the New Forest. New Forest has got a bit of a problem that they've got two different coastlines which affect different protected sites, so that they've got to sort of look at solutions in two different parts of their area. On the south coast, Pennington, Lymington and those sorts of areas, they are working with the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust to secure a mitigation site. And on the more populated waterside area, they are still looking at a potentially significant wetlands project. And that would be a sort of a wetlands which could potentially be downstream of a wastewater treatment work. So it would actually affect the wastewater nitrates, not just the surface water, because of the drainage relationship with the wastewater treatment works there. So that would be encouraging if that did come to fruition, would help a great deal. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to Christian, who's going to finish off our session.
Thanks, Peter. And just to wrap up on what was said across the presentation. So as Simon touched on, the key here is to find solutions to allow sustainable development to continue to take place in the Solent. And that's only going to happen through cooperation by local authorities across the administrative boundaries of the catchment areas. And as Peter showed on his map, the catchment areas cover quite a significant amount of land, and far greater than the European sites that are being protected. So there's a lot of development that will be caught by this requirement for nutrient neutrality. Fortunately, as Doug touched on, there are both short-term actions and longer-term actions underway that will hopefully ensure that solutions including environmental land management schemes, come forward over time. And Purgle talked us through the nutrient trading pilot, which will hopefully come online over the next couple of years, and that will have additional benefits through also trading other credits such as biodiversity net gain credits. As Peter mentioned, there are some limitations to the solutions that have come forward. Not all of them are a single solution to achieve nutrient neutrality, and some of these solutions may in the long term have an impact on the agricultural land market. And the supply of solutions isn't evenly dispersed over the catchment areas. And ironically, the largest area impacted by this issue has in fact got the smallest number of agricultural land offsetting schemes. So what I will do is just take some of the questions and hand those out. It won't be a moment. So just on catchment, thanks to Tony Langridge, who has mentioned that a new mitigation scheme is available at Abbottstone. So thanks for pointing that out. I will also mention phosphates in a moment, but I'd like to take a question from Daniel Ramirez and put this to Doug or Purgle, I think, in the first place. So HBF research has indicated that 1,200 hectares of farmlands would need to be purchased and converted to nature projects to clear the current backlog in the Solent region. Do DEFRA or Natural England view this as being achievable and as a sustainable solution? So Doug or Purgle, if you could address that.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. I can have a go at that one. Yeah, we're certainly very conscious of the need to try and maximize the land use efficiency, if you like, of mitigation measures. So the water quality modelling work that I referred to is trying to give us a better handle of the kind of the scale of land potentially required for mitigation. I think the backlog is perhaps now a lower figure than you state in your question, although I'd defer to some of the latest data from local authorities on that. But yeah, I mean, certainly there is a land requirement, clearly, if we're needing some off-site mitigation solutions. So the challenge that we're looking at is how do we kind of try to minimize that as far as possible? And so using the water quality modeling to try and target mitigation sites where they'll have most bang for the kind of land take is one means of trying to do that. I think also important to be aware that, you know, things like wetland schemes can generate much more credits per unit area than other types of land use change. And also you've got to look at the types of land use change. So if you're changing from a fairly intensive use like a pig farm or poultry farm, then you're going to generate a lot more credits from that by taking that sort of agricultural practice out of use. And the other thing I just mentioned was some of those wider actions that I've talked about. So if the permits review does trigger the need for upgrades to a number of wastewater treatment work, then clearly that will reduce the offsetting requirements for a number of developments.
Okay, thanks for that, Doug. I'm mindful of time, so I wonder if I could jump to a question about phosphates. And a number of us have been involved in mitigation schemes for phosphates, particularly in the Somerset area. And I've had a question here asking what the panel see happening in Somerset, and I suppose this probably now applies to Cornwall, South Wales and elsewhere. Is it clear that the Somerset local authorities have caught up with understanding the issue in terms of phosphates and can use the Solent model to quickly get up to speed in terms of solutions? And I wonder, that's probably one again for you, Doug, or Purgle.
Yeah, I can certainly pick up that, and then I'll let Purgle come in if she'd like to. Yeah, we're certainly very aware of the Somerset pilot there, and we're keeping close contact with how that is developing. As I understand it, they're hoping to implement a first market round within the coming months. And we're certainly kind of comparing notes in terms of our learning around some of the challenges around legal agreements, for example, and how they're going about structuring the process. It's obviously a slightly different scheme there in that it is focused on phosphates rather than nitrates. And as I understand it, it is focused on a range of different offsetting requirements. So it's not just looking at developers' needs through HAB regs, but it's also looking at some kind of shorter solutions as well. But Pogo, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think you said most of what I was going to say. I think the fact that they're looking at in perpetuity mitigation as well as shorter term mitigation means that it's quite a versatile market that they're creating. And although it is phosphorus, there is no reason why nitrogen couldn't be added at a later date. And obviously nitrogen will be reduced through the long-term mitigation measures. So I think they're in a really good place, and they're obviously working with their local authorities to get them all on board with these schemes. They'll have to sign up to the legal agreements that are around that land use change for in terms of long-term land use change for development. So I think they're in a really good place. I don't know too much about what's happening with Cornwall at this point, but obviously our Solent learning will be shared, and the aim is that that will be able to be then used widely.
Great, thanks, Pogo. I'll hand over to Nicola now because time has got away from us.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks. I was just going to say that we'll do one more question, but this is being recorded and the slides will be available. So anybody that needs to go now, they can watch, or indeed the information was so intense and so detailed that I think if you wanted to watch it again, you would not be criticised at all. I will definitely be watching it and trying to gather some more information. But if anyone has got any burning desire to answer one more question, would they like to do so now, and then we can call it a day? That's great. Good. Simon, I'll pick on you then. You have a specific question directed to you.
I do, but I'm just going to answer two very, very quickly, because David Bibby from Test Valley Borough Council makes a very important point. They now have a scheme in place for Test Valley Borough Council, which I think Peter's presentation is just missed that, and it has been very current. And then very quickly, Tony Langridge talks about the handball. The Botley scheme from Eastleigh Borough Council will serve the handball catchment now. Chichester District Council, yes, we're very much working on it, and we're nearly there. Chris, give me an email or a LinkedIn or however you want to catch me, and I'll cover that one-to-one if you want. But yeah, progress definitely being made. Thanks.
Can I just say, with local planning authorities, it's fantastic news with Test Valley, but you've got to make that clear to your development management officers who just last week were emailing to say that they've got no solution and that the developers have to come up with their own plan. So why not mention it? Why not put that there? So publicize it. If you have done something, get it known, put it on your website, let people know about it, then you can, follow it through with development queries.
Great, thank you. So lastly, just to finish off, there's one more poll. It'll be 2 seconds, and let's just see if anyone feels like, following what you've heard today, do you feel nutrient neutrality is more achievable than you previously understood to be the case? So if we give that 10 seconds. Oh dear. I think that's going to be enough for us. So what we'll do is we'll end the polling now. Okay, and I'll share that with you all, everyone. So we've got a little bit, and yes, so that's a lot better than no. With that in mind, I will say goodbye. Thank you to all of our speakers today. Really appreciate their time, and if you have any questions to any of us specifically, please don't hesitate to get into contact. Thank you. Bye-bye.